2019 iteration of the Chair's Lecture Series. We've got both the old guard and that's no comment, Mark. It's just the old guard and the new guard in our roster this year. And I'm pleased to say that we really have had the opportunity to be hiring actively over this last 2 years, so that we will get the opportunity to hear from a large number of our newest academic appointments. So we can follow the senior team with the junior team, and there will be a lot of them to hear from between now and it's the last one, the end of March, early April. So without belaboring the point, the floor belongs to Dr. Mark Boyce, and a story about wolves from Yellowstone. It is all yours, Mark, and thank you.
Thank you. So this guy is C. Hart Merriam. He invented the discipline of mammalogy and was director of the National Biological Survey for many, many years. The classic splitter, he described 85 species of grizzly bears. But the American Society of Mammalogists has an award called the C. Hart Merriam Award for research, and I got that this year, and that's what motivated me to put this talk together, as well as the paper that will appear in the October issue of the Journal of Mammalogy. And my motivation was wanting to sort of wrap up 40 years of having worked in Yellowstone. I started, my first academic appointment was at the University of Wyoming in 1976, and I started working in the Yellowstone ecosystem in 1977. And so it's been 40 years that I've been doing this stuff. And it's a good time to just sort of wrap it up and wash my hands of it and never do any more work in Yellowstone again. Unless somebody comments on my paper, and then that might keep me going. I don't know. But these are all graduate students and colleagues who've contributed to the work that I will be talking about today. So in 1926, the National Park Service, not the ranching community and whatnot, the National Park Service extirpated wolves from Yellowstone National Park. They killed the last one. And then FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, implemented this Civilian Conservation Corps, and they got the rest of them out of western United States. So they were pretty well completely gone from western United States by the mid 30s. But not long after extirpating wolves and cougars from Yellowstone Park, the numbers of elk started to build up to the point that everybody recognized that the vegetation was being affected in a big way. And so they started culls of elk. in the park, starting in the 1930s, and they weren't able to keep up with it. The herd of elk just kept getting bigger and bigger, and they got really serious about it in the 1960s. And their target was to try to bring the herd down to about 4,000 animals on the northern range. And this created a bit of a stir because it got some media attention. And in fact, in 1967, I can remember watching ABC Evening News when they showed video footage of a herd of elk running in front of a line of park rangers, and they mowed them all down. And then they came in with semi-trucks, refrigerated semi-trucks, and they butchered them and hauled them off to the Crow Indian Reservation just north of the park. And there was a lot of pushback from the public, and Senator Gale McGee from Wyoming was catching the most flack from his constituents, and he leaned on the Park Service, George Herzog, and Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of Interior at the time, to stop this. That it was nuts. And again, the public image was very negative about the way in which it was being done as a mass slaughter in the park. But the ecologists in the park thought that it was necessary, or they were convinced that it was necessary to cull the elk. And a guy by the name of Glenn Cole, who was the biologist at the time, decided to try to make the best out of a bad deal and to test what was a very popular topic in ecology at that time. And that was the notion of natural regulation, the role of density dependence and plant-herbivore interactions in limiting the numbers of a large herbivore like this. And so instead of just throwing up their hands, they decided we're going to make this into a grand experiment, and we're going to see what happens when we don't cull elk. And indeed, they did. I'm going to figure out which buttons to push. And along with that, the park decided that they needed to do something about the fact that all the predators had been eliminated, and they needed to restore wolves. And I'd been working in the Yellowstone ecosystem since 1977, did a lot of work with elk, and wrote this book on the Jackson elk herd, and there's a lot of population modeling in here, as you might expect. And so John Varley, the guy on the right, convinced me that I should expand my models to anticipate the consequences of wolf recovery. And what he didn't tell me was that he also got Oz Garton and Jim Peake to do the same thing at the same time, so we had dueling models. And and I didn't learn about it until later that this was going on. But Oz and I came up with almost exactly the same result. I put a lot of time into the stochastic variation side of it, and so mine had more complexity to it. But the deterministic models of Oz and my stochastic model means were very, very similar in terms of their outcome. I won't talk about Jim's model. But basically, I had 5 simultaneous difference equations, and these are classic models from population ecology with the density-dependent term for the herbivores, with a stochastic carrying capacity driven by winter severity and summer range condition. And that's one of the things Evie and I had been studying for several years, so we had a pretty good handle on that K-dot. And then this is the functional response for the ith species of herbivore, and elk being far and away the most important one. And then that's the equation for the predators. And an important piece to notice here is that the wolf equation has density dependence in it as well, which turned out to be pretty controversial for some crazy reason. I can't understand why. You'd have thought a territorial species like that ought to have a density-dependent term in it, but Francois Messier and Rolf Peterson and I had some heated exchanges about that, but I won out in the end because when they got the data, it was very clear that density dependence belonged there. And then Buzz Holling from UBC did the multi-species functional response model that I used, the Type 3 functional response, meaning a logistic-shaped functional response that has density dependence at lower abundances. And so I put this all together into an interactive model. As I mentioned, I have density dependence for wolves in the model, and I had very detailed information about the harvest because the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has a prescription for how many permits they're going to issue, and it's density dependent. And then, as I mentioned, Evie and I had been studying the influence of winter severity and summer range, determining the stochastic carrying capacity. And the way I built the model, you never got the same result twice. And so I put this with a user-friendly interface on a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk. Now, this is a fairly gray audience, and I suppose most of you have seen these before. But you show this to a group of undergrads and they have no idea what the heck is that. But anyway, but I copied 100 of these and distributed them to high schools and government offices in the Yellowstone area so that people could play with it and they could see that depending on the management decisions that they made within the model, you'll get a different result. And that's what I wanted people to understand. That it mattered how we manage that system as to what kind of outcome we'll get. The data that went into this, largely driven by Doug Houston's long-term study on elk on the northern range, and Lou Carbon, who isn't here today, but he's around most of the time. And Lou did his PhD in Riding Mountain National Park on elk-wolf interactions. And that's the only study that had ever been done on wolf-elk interactions at that time, at the time that I did this. So his thesis work was very influential in me being able to parameterize the elk portions of the model. There was a lot of work that had been done on moose, the classic Isle Royale studies and studies in Alaska and Canada, but the elk stuff was pretty dependent on Lou's stuff. So then, after many years of preparation and reports to Congress, in 1995, wolves from Alberta were released in Yellowstone National Park. 14 were released in the initial group. They captured 15 and one died in transit. But they did a soft release. They had pens on the northern range where they held them for several months and fed them roadkills and eventually then let them go. And the rest is all history. So after 10 years after wolf reintroduction, we went back and looked at my model to see how well it did. And so these dotted lines are just 5 iterations to show you the magnitude of variability that you get from separate runs of the model. But then these dots here, the square dots are the actual population abundances of elk subsequent to wolf reintroduction. And so numbers of elk went down and has been fluctuating around a long-term mean as we predicted that it would do. And so I was rather smug at first until we started looking at the model and looking at the data. And that was the idea behind adaptive management, Carl Walter's idea that you go back and you evaluate how well your model did, and then you fix the model. We had a number of things that were really wrong. One is that the wolves really focused on elk. They killed over 90, well, in fact, most years 95% of their prey were elk. They were almost exclusively feeding on elk, and and so there was more of an effect on elk than what we would have anticipated. But one of the really cool results from our study, and this is Ralph Peterson's student, Jerry Wright, who died of colon cancer a couple years ago. But and that's Henrik Thurfjell up in the photo up there, who was a postdoc in the lab here for a couple of years. But one of the outcomes of the data that we collected during that first decade was the contrast between the age distribution of elk killed by wolves versus that killed by hunters. And you can see that the hunters were taking prime age animals with a high reproductive value, whereas wolves were taking, it doesn't show here the number of calves that they were killing, but they were killing mostly older aged animals, calves and animals older than about 9 or 10. One of the things that Henrik did was to explore what was going on with these older older cows because they became almost bulletproof once they got to be about 9 or 10 because they learn to avoid hunters and they get pretty good at it. So there's a huge difference between the reproductive value. So reproductive value is the per capita influence of removing an individual of a certain age, and the per capita influence of removing individuals by hunting is much, much greater than it is the effect of wolf predation, than is the effect of wolf predation. I didn't have any of that in the original model. And so Nathan Varley, who was a PhD student with me here in the department, worked on updating the model. And so we developed a structured population model, had the same essential features of the previous model, but some of these gory details of age and sex. And so we updated the model and did new predictions of what we expected to happen. But over the next 10 years, so the first 10 years, the forecasts were pretty good. The next 10 years, the numbers of elk were lower than what we had predicted. And I am quite confident that the reason for that is that we did not anticipate the large role that grizzly bears and cougars were having on the system. And grizzly bears get really very good at finding and killing elk calves. And I remember one day with Francis Singer sitting along the road watching this grizzly bear in Gardner's Hole, just going systematically back and forth across Gardner's Hole here looking for elk calves. And it was good at finding. And that same grizzly bear, we know, came back year after year and did the same thing. And so this is something that the grizzly bears weren't doing previously, and so this was something that had changed over time, and the influence of grizzly bears became stronger and stronger. Also, the government had pretty well wiped out cougars, but they came back on their own. They didn't need a reintroduction to get them going, but they came back as well. And cougars are very effective predators as well. They take about 70% elk in their diet in Yellowstone Park. But again, we didn't have cougars in our original model. So again, all kinds of flaws in the model. So these are the actual data for the northern range, and you can see that the number of elk are the blue dots, and it's gone down. And then what we expected from a predator-prey system is that you'd see the wolves come up and the elk go down, and you get this fluctuating oscillation towards some long-term equilibrium. And that's pretty believable. This year, 17-18, so this spring, the numbers of elk were up even to almost 8,000. So everything sort of fit, and this was a mange outbreak that resulted in a loss of some wolves. But another thing that we hadn't anticipated and was not in the model, and we never guessed was going to happen, is how much of a response we got by bison. And bison used to be mostly up in the Hayden Valley and over in the Pelican, in the central parts of the park. And occasionally on a tough winter, there'd be some bison that would move out of the park. But the bison shifted their distribution to occupy northern range. It used to be the primary area that was occupied by elk, and the number of bison has just been increasing and increasing, and it's still increasing. And the politicians, like Trump's Secretary of Interior, think that we've got to do something because there are so many bison, and the numbers just keep going up. So there's been a lot of excitement about this highly celebrated ecological experiment of reintroducing wolves. And a lot of the excitement relates to this notion of a trophic cascade. And so a trophic cascade the idea is to go up, down, like on a cascade. That if you increase predation, increased wolves, that they'll cause a reduction in the number of elk, and then that'll allow a release in the vegetation. And exactly how that rolls out could be density mediated directly, that the number of elk being killed by wolves is causing this change in herbivory. Or it could be a behavioral landscape of fear kind of an effect. And this has been one of the big controversies in the whole Yellowstone arena, is sorting out the role of density mediated versus trait mediated responses. But the idea, again, though, is that you've got wolves eating elk, and elk eat vegetation. But the herbaceous vegetation is pretty resilient, it's turned out, to herbivory. But it's the woody vegetation where we're seeing the big response, especially the riparian vegetation. So willows and cottonwood in riparian areas. The cottonwood, the aspen story is a very complicated one, and we'll come back to that. But we focused on willow because willow are widely distributed across the northern range. Cottonwood are very scarce. They're only right there near the town of Mammoth. There are some old cottonwoods, and they're scattered here and there. But in general, cottonwood were very severely suppressed by heavy herbivory over 70 years of high elk numbers. So willow, though, really do get clobbered by elk in particular. High browsing rates, average of 48% with 80% of the annual growth being removed, but high variability. And that's one of the key punchlines of my talk, is the enormous amount of variability that we're seeing. So Hawthorne Beyer was a graduate student in my lab, and he's now at the University of Queensland, and a very outstanding spatial ecologist. But Hawthorne studied willow on the northern range and sampled stems, and he did thin cross sections, and then looked to see how much growth there was in each year going back, and was able to reconstruct the effect of herbivory over time based upon the growth of these willow. And this is a very important slide, because one of the things that it shows is that for different plots, there are 18 plots for each of these species. So Salix boothii, which is Beb willow, and Salix guyeriana, that any individual site, there may not be any change at all. But there are other sites where we got an enormous response subsequent to wolf reintroduction. Likewise with guyeriana, that overall things were humming along, but then we got a good number of the sites where we had a huge increase, but enormous variability among sites. And then just the statistics of GLM, looking at the proportion of stems browsed and snow. This might seem counterintuitive, but elk prefer to graze, and if they have access to grass, they'll eat grass even in the winter. But the more snow there is, then they're forced to feed on willow and other browse that sticks up above the snow. And so you get the biggest effect of herbivory by elk in years of heavy snow. And then there's also a huge seasonal effect. And there's a seasonal effect in the timing of herbivory, as well as in the activity patterns by the wolves. So this just shows the herbivory response. And so we don't get very much herbivory on willow, until you've started to accumulate enough snow that it sort of pushes them into having to feed on it. And so we get a big increase from December to February in the proportion of browse stems. This may not seem like much of a surprise, but it helps to interpret some of the peculiar results by a fellow by the name of Bill Ripple from Oregon State. But a point that I want to drive home is the enormous variability from site to site and from valley to valley. So this is the Blacktail Plateau, which is sort of the middle of the park on the northern range, off to the south of the road that goes through to the Lamar. And this just shows, as of 2012, which was the lowest abundance of elk that we've seen, the response of the willow. And some of this willow is taller than I am. There's a bison here for scale. But the willow in some sites responded really well. But in other sites, this is just the same as it always has been. So this is just just south of Mammoth. And this area has always had a lot of elk and bison herbivory, but especially elk. And it still has a lot of elk herbivory. And I have a photo that I took in 1985 of this exact site, and it looks pretty much the same as it did way back then. One big difference is that there are no willow stems anymore out here. It used to be that the density of willow stems was as high out here as it was inside the exclosure. The exclosure was built in 1958, but after many, many years of heavy herbivory, they've killed the willow. I mentioned cottonwood, and over the last few years, there have been 1.3 million new cottonwoods recruited on the northern range. And the reason is because of flooding events. And we've known about it. We've known that it takes just the right conditions for cottonwoods to be able to establish. But 2008, in particular, we had a really good season for cottonwood establishment, and there are lots of cottonwoods showing up now. That this combination of reduced elk numbers and good flooding conditions resulted in very good establishment of cottonwood. Now, a friend of mine from Colorado State, Tom Hobbs, who was actually offered my position before I was offered the position. He turned it down because his mother was ailing or something. Right. But Tom has been working in the Yellowstone ecosystem as well, and he did these experiments with 3 treatments and 4 replicates, where the treatments were, they had exclosures, so fence to keep the elk and bison out, and then controls where nothing was done, and then he had he built these artificial dams to simulate a beaver dam to alter the hydrology, and so you had dammed only and then dammed and exclosure, and you can see it quite dramatically in some of these slides. So these are the artificial dams that he built, and they measured willow height and biomass. And in the control, the willow are unable to get high enough to escape herbivory. So you need to be up there at about 2 meters to be able to escape herbivory. But with just a fenced exclosure to keep the herbivores out, you can actually get recruitment of willow. But if you dam it, it does even better. And the ideal is altering the herbivory and the hydrology, and you get an enormous response by the vegetation. And you can see it here clearly, where there's a dam over here, and so we have response by the willow in particular, in the area where the hydrology has been enhanced with the dam. And then here we've got, it's dammed and fenced, and here is a control on the, over the slope where both herbivory and dry conditions result in much lower willow growth. So we monitored the elk subsequent to wolf reintroduction, and we used GPS radio telemetry, and we hired helicopter crew to do the captures, and I was along on this flight. It's terrifying and it's dangerous, and I'm so glad that we can hire these guys and don't have to send our students out to do this kind of thing anymore, because I have yet to lose a student whilst they were graduate students. They leave my lab and then they fly into a mountain, but I've lost 4. But it's the most dangerous thing we do, and so I'm happy to pay these guys $1,000 per elk to put a radio collar on and take samples. But my student, Julie Mao, followed the elk for 3 years. Very detailed observations on a radio collared elk, and but we also had really good data from the park on the wolves. So there's a lot of interest in monitoring the wolves, and so Doug Smith from the park was monitoring the wolves, and so this shows breeding season home ranges for elk, and you can see a couple packs of elk. That's the Druid pack over there, and this is the blacktail. What Julie observed was that in these areas where the wolves are really concentrated during the denning season, that the elk, there's kind of halos of activity by the elk around those areas, and they didn't often go into the core of the home range near the dens of the wolves. A dangerous place to go. And there's a daily fluctuation in their activity patterns as well. But so we followed up on this in more detail and looked to see where kills by wolves of elk were occurring on the northern range. And so these are 10 years of wolf home range distributions, and what we found was that during the first 5 years, when there were still substantial interstitial spaces between the wolf pack territories, that the distribution of the wolves was an important predictor of where elk kills were going to occur. In other words, the elk were able to avoid where the wolves were, and they were still getting killed out in there, but the distribution of wolves was an important predictor of where elk kills occurred. But starting in about year 2001, wolves had pretty well saturated the entire northern range, and there was no place where they could get away. And so then all that determined the distribution of elk kills by wolves was topography and vegetation. Those were important predictors, but you couldn't really get a signal on the presence of wolves because wolves were everywhere. And so we interpreted this as a behavioral response, that the elk were able to avoid wolves during that early period, but then as the wolf numbers increased, there was no escape, and especially during the wintertime, because in the wintertime the wolves will follow the elk around. So as it relates to movements, I had a postdoc, Danielle Fortin, who worked on the telemetry data, looking at how the elk moved in response to the distribution of wolves and the vegetation and topography. And so transforming that landscape into a nice patch distribution with an elk there. We then monitor where that elk goes, and we characterize movement with two metrics. One is the turning angle, so they get up to here, and then they usually go kind of straight, directional persistence, but they turn. You can see there's a peak here at 0 because of directional persistence, and then the step length distribution looks like this. And most of the steps are fairly short, but they make some long ones, some interpatch movement steps. But what occurred to Danielle was, well, what we can do is we can contrast those steps with where they might have gone. So we can look at alternative steps that they could have taken and then contrast what they actually took, the step that they actually took, with those alternative potential steps based upon those distributions predicting these red lines. And that method is called a step selection function. It's become very popular. But what we can do is we can predict where they're going to move based upon these different habitat type covariants. And one of the things that Danielle found was that that as you increase the frequency of occurrence of wolves on the landscape, that the elk tend to move out of aspen stands, and they tend to go either into open areas or into conifer black timber. And the interpretation that we put on this was that, you know, an open aspen stand, and most of the aspen stands in Yellowstone are pretty open because herbivory is keeping the suckers suppressed. An open aspen stand is a pretty dangerous place for an elk because the wolves can see them, wolves can get up on them, and so elk avoid the particular topography and conditions, but in general we found that they were moving out of those areas when wolves were in the area. But you know, we found good evidence supporting this whole notion of a trophic cascade inside the park, but outside the park, it's a very different story. So Dave Meach has an interesting little paper entitled "Is Science Sanctifying the Wolf?" And outside the boundaries of Yellowstone Park, I mean, right at the hard boundary, you've got livestock, and you've got hunting, and those two factors especially alter the system in a big way. So Andrea Morehouse, who just finished her PhD, a little over a year and a half ago, I suppose, here, studied wolf predation on large mammals in an agricultural landscape in southwestern Alberta, in the Pincher Creek area. And during the grazing season, from May through October, 45% of the prey items that were killed by wolves were cattle. It's not surprising that ranchers want to get rid of them because they can be a serious problem. 22% deer, 13% elk, and 9% moose. And these are just frequencies, and the biomass is even higher because cattle have a lot of meat on the hoof, and so 75% of the biomass of their prey were cattle. And so you get a very different system outside the park. And so Tyler Muley worked with us on putting together the pieces. And humans have a very large effect by altering they plant hay, for example. and they alter pastures. And that has a very positive effect on both elk and cattle. Wolves don't tend to go out into the fields as much, and so there's a negative correlation there. Humans kill wolves. They're not terribly good at it, but they kill some. And the whole configuration of the system is much more sort of bottom up, rather than a trophic cascade driven from the top. It's much more of a bottom up kind of system. So humans totally alter the system from the ground up, and we can't expect the same sort of trophic cascade, the same sort of beneficial consequences of having wolves in the system outside of a protected area like a national park. So what have we learned? Trophic level interactions are inherently dynamic in time and space. Population ecology 331, you get a good dose of the fact that the trophic level interactions are dynamic, that you get these various types of fluctuations that occur. And we have documented enormous site variation in browsing pressure, soils, moisture composition, meaning that the whole system is highly variable as a consequence of these trophic level interactions that are influencing trophic cascades dynamically across the landscape. So, and we're having both numerical and behavioral responses depending on the timing and the particular location. So again, the trophic cascades are increasing the spatial and temporal variability. But there are all these things that we learned about this system that we didn't really anticipate very well. And it sort of drives home the importance of maintaining parks and natural areas as ecological baseline reserves, so we can see what we're doing to the rest of the planet, because everywhere else is being boogered. And so this whole notion of ecological process management has its roots in the Starker-Leopold report from 1963, advising the National Park Service on how they ought to be managing wildlife populations in the parks, and then a complicated long story about the management of grizzly bears in Yellowstone, and cougars coming back, and an enormous ramifications for the distribution of beavers. Beavers are coming back. They were gone from Yellowstone Park because the elk had eaten all of the willow. But now beavers are back, and all of the songbirds that go with the riparian vegetation, yellow warblers, for example, are coming back. And another important component, critically important in Yellowstone, but also in our parks, is the role of fire, and allowing natural ecological process to prevail, so that we can see what we do. But the one that scares me a little bit is this guy, and bison are increasing rapidly, and they have brucellosis that they can transmit to livestock, and so when they hit the border, they're removed. They're usually shot. And how we're going to be managing bison in the future is a real hot topic right now, and I'm just hoping that the National Park Service will stick by its guns on this whole notion of ecological process management and allow the system to roll out. We don't know what the future portends with bison in the park, but we're sure going to learn a lot more about it if we let it roll out rather than interfering in a way in which we really don't know what we're doing. Lots of collaborators. I've listed most of my students on the title slide. Doug Smith has been particularly helpful. He's the wolf guy in Yellowstone National Park and has managed teams of wolf observers year after year in the park. And Dan Stoller is an assistant working with him. And these are mostly collaborators and various sources of funding. So I'd be happy to entertain questions.
Is it possible to vaccinate the bison for brucellosis? Is there an oral vaccine that could be administered in salt licks or anything like that?
They've been working on that for some time. You know, an oral vaccine would be really slick if you could put it in molasses or something and somehow administer it that way, but not yet.
Not so far. So there's no program for, I don't know, darting them with vaccine. Then you'd have to mark who got darted. So
Yeah. It's a major undertaking, and it can be hard to detect whether they have it or not. But yes, they can be vaccinated, and there is a vaccine that is, I've forgotten the efficacy, but it's like 80% or something like that. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, you said a boundary in connection with the bison. Was it the park boundary, or is it the boundary to Canada, or what?
Oh, no, the park, the Yellowstone National Park boundary.
Yeah.
So there's a corral at Stevens Creek, which is just northwest of the town of Mammoth in Yellowstone, and bison that, and they pretty well need to go that way. They can go over a steep cliff, potentially, but they don't. I mean, they tend to go through this corral area, and they've got fence lines to round them up and test them and slaughter some, and then some of them are shipped off for release in Indian reservations.
So the same diseases in the Alberta bison, right?
So there is brucellosis in bison at a fairly high prevalence rate, and I shouldn't say it's much higher than for elk. For elk, I do know it's 42% prevalence in the Jackson elk herd that are fed on the Winter Range, but it's only about like 4% on the Northern Range in Yellowstone Park. For bison, it's much higher in Yellowstone Park because they're herding animals and they transmit it more readily. They usually transmit it by licking an aborted fetus or afterbirth, and that's how they usually transmit it onto other individuals. But because bison are usually in herds, it transmits really well amongst the bison. Stephanie.
I have a question about the fate of the carcasses during the height of the elk culling. I'm assuming they weren't left in the system, and so I'm wondering if you have any insights into the consequences of this restoration for just the whole energy budget of the system and the nutrient cycling and soil quality.
Yeah. So after natural regulation kicked in, carcasses were let lay. And that was influential in the recovery of grizzly bears in the park after the fiasco of 1971 when they closed the dumps and so forth. But in the springtime, the grizzly bears would feed on these carcasses, and it almost ensured that a female with cubs could get her cubs through if she could get onto a carcass at that crucial time when the snow was first melting in the spring. So it was very important. But since wolf reintroduction, the amount of winter kills has sort of dried up. In the winter of 1995-96, the first year that wolves were reintroduced, there were 7,500 elk that died on the Northern Range. And so there were lots of carcasses, and it was quite different than it is today because wolves keep up with the with the weak and the sick and the old ones. And so there are, when we have a tough winter, we don't get nearly the die-off. And there aren't nearly so many animals to be dying as well. And the herd has shifted. So a lot more of the animals go outside the park, Dome Mountain and areas just north of Gardner, Montana. There's a huge population of elk that use an area that was purchased by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation during the crisis period. And so that's all now available for elk to use as winter range. And so there are many fewer, there are only 1,500 elk or so on the northern range this winter. And the majority are actually moving out. But that's sort of opening things up for the bison, and so bison are expanding. So yeah, the whole system is changing in a big way. Stan.
So you've given one version of the story of this grand experiment. If you engage a number of other people, they'll give you quite a different story and how this has all unfolded. So thinking back over those 40 years and that, can you think of any things that should have been done differently in terms of the science that may have allowed us to get rid of the controversy that exists over the interpretation of any of these sorts of results?
Replication would have been nice. Yes, exactly. So the experimental results, I think Tom Hobbs's work is so important because it's collecting the kinds of data that we really need to document what's going on. The park's interested in the wolves because they're high profile, and it's hard to even convince them that they should do their aerial surveys for the number of elk. It's all about wolves, and they get all these people who want to come out and follow the wolves around. But providing more detailed information about the ecology of the system is what was really lacking, and so there was a void there, and it was obvious that certain things needed to be done, but it was people like me and outsiders, rather than the park, collecting these data and really being on top of it. We had Bill Ripple from Oregon State and me and Tom and Monica Turner and a few others doing work on the plant-herbivore interactions to try to fill in some of the gaps. One of the big controversies relates to the details of behavioral response, whether the behavioral response is still a major factor determining the influence of elk on herbivory. And I tend to agree with Kaufman that it's mostly a numerical response now. And there was a behavioral response early on. Hawthorne's work and the early work that we did with Kaufman, there was a behavioral response during the first few years. But then after that, that whole system has changed. Wolves are concentrated around their dens during the late winter, spring period, but by July, they're off following the elk around. And so during half the year, the distribution of wolves is not having an effect on distribution of elk. Ripple sampled the vegetation in September at the, and so one of the flashpoints in terms of, Hobbs denigrating Ripple's work because it doesn't make any sense to sample then because the elk haven't had their influence on the woody plants yet that for that season. But there are some strong personalities involved, and it certainly has been like this for the last several years. But I kind of agree with everybody in context, in that I think that there are both behavioral and numerical responses depending on time and location. Aaron.
One of your graphs, early ones, show the wolf response, right, or like the wolf numbers 1995 right after, but the first 2 years after they were released, there were no elk numbers on your slides. That's because you're trying to...
So Stu Coleman was the chief ranger at that time, and I talked to him about it. I said, this is crazy. You've got to be monitoring these elk. And he said, well, we got our wolves back. You know, I'm going to use that money for something else. Stu Coleman, the chief ranger, decided not to fly for 2 years as an economic, anyway. But they've been pretty good about it ever since then. They've kept up, but yeah.
Are the wolves staying in the park, or are they leaving to go get cattle? Because they seem to like cattle more than.
Yeah, they're not staying in the park, no. And so in the park itself, there are about 100 wolves, and it's been amazingly consistent. So. I made a big deal about how much spatial heterogeneity there is and temporal heterogeneity, but if you average over the entire park, it's up here and it's down here, it's up here and it's down, and the number of wolves is about 100 inside the park. In the northern Rockies, there are about 2,300 wolves. And so they're well established in Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and they're now breeding viable populations in Oregon and Washington, and they're showing up in California.
Is that because they're moving down from us, or is that because they're spreading from the park?
Well, mostly spreading from the park, but also supplemented by ours. So in 1956, we had a rabies outbreak in Alberta, and wolves were poisoned and shot extensively. So now we have about 7,000 wolves in Alberta, but we were down to about 1,500, and they were all in the north. And the southern populations of wolves in Alberta were pretty well wiped out, and it wasn't until 1985 that a wolf showed up in Banff National Park. And then quite quickly after that, they started working their way south and across the border. First den in Glacier National Park was 1988. And so there has been an expansion across the northern Rockies, both in Canada and in the United States.
Okay. I was curious about the behavioral change you mentioned in the grizzly bears and how that might have tied into the wolves then. When that happened?
So grizzly bears are bigger, and they're kind of formidable to wolves, and a bear will just chase them away. So by and large, wolves are displaced off of kills by grizzly bears. So if a grizzly bear finds a kill the wolves have made, they'll chase them off and usurp the carcass. And I've seen that happen actually with the sow and cubs. But the fact that they're using more and more elk is something that's happening pretty much throughout the Rockies. And the Yahatinda study that Evie's been leading has shown exactly the same thing, that grizzly bears are becoming very substantial predators on calves. And there's a synthesis paper, 2011 Journal of Animal Ecology, across the Western North America, showing that grizzly bears are probably the primary predator on elk calves. Black bears also take quite a few elk calves, but especially grizzly bears. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, because I was thinking you had mentioned that they all of a sudden started doing the searches for the elk calves.
Well, bear numbers have been increasing, but they leveled off by. I don't think there are any more grizzly bears in the park now than there were in 2000. They pretty well saturated the park by the time that wolves were released, and all of the available habitat was occupied. In 1971, Yellowstone closed the dumps, and there used to be a big dump in Hayden Valley on French Creek, and they had bleachers, and so it was very popular. People who went to the park had to go down in the evening and sit in the bleachers and watch the dump trucks come along and dump the garbage out, and the bears were all over it, and so that was your chance to see bears. And it was a major source of food for the bears. And the park decided in 1971 that this was inconsistent with park management philosophy, and they decided to close the dumps cold turkey. And the Craigheads, who were doing research in the area, were very upset about this and, went to the media, and the Craigheads got kicked out of the park. They weren't allowed to do research in the park. They've been working in the park since 1956 or so. I don't see Jan here. He could give me a more, Jan Murray, of course, would give me the exact date. But years and years, they developed the whole business of radio telemetry collars, working on bears in the park. That was all kind of invented there. But come 1971 and the brouhaha that went around the closure of the dumps, they got kicked out of the park, so they weren't allowed to work there anymore. John and Frank Craighead. But subsequent to that, the bear population crashed. It went down to about 183 at the minimum, and the distribution was really cool because there was like a flower, a rosette surrounding the dumps. So all of the bears would have a home range that would intersect at the dumps, and the cub mortality was really high because it would put the females with cubs in contact with males, and the males would kill the cubs. But then subsequent to that, there was a crash in the bear population as they figured out how to feed on natural foods. They distributed themselves throughout the park, and now they're much better distributed throughout the park, feeding on natural foods. But it went from 1983 until the early 90s. There was a fairly rapid increase, but then it leveled off. And so the expansion of bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem has been outside the park, expanding their distribution. They're now down in the Wind Rivers and the Wyoming Range south of the park, and up into Montana. They're not in Idaho. They haven't made it into Idaho yet. No. Hard to get across Highway 15, I think.
All right. No more questions? I have one thing before we'll thank Mark for the last segment. The department now has new swag. Linda insisted I gift wrap it. Dr. Boyce, as a thank you for the lead speaker, and I'm sure for the next speakers. And by the way, the next installment is October 11th, and that will be Dr. Lynn Long. We don't have a talk title yet, I believe, but I'm sure it's coming soon, and you'll see advertisements. But again, Mark, thanks very much. Great opener. Please eat, drink, and make merry.